have 3 short presentations up at the podium, followed by a group conversation. One of the thrilling parts of the So Their Names project for us was really to attempt to think about the history that surrounds Lowndes County. And as part of our forum every year, we really strive to bring scholars from across the country that we admire to Auburn, who can help us think about the history of art in the American South in new ways. I'm thrilled that we have 3 such guests with us today. First, Leslie Umberger, Senior Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, will speak. Among her many accomplishments, she was the curator of Between Worlds, The Art of Bill Traylor, which opened at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in 2018. Following Leslie's talk, we'll have Darby English, who's the Carl Darling Buck Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago. From 2014 to 2020, he was adjunct curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which culminated in the project, among others, Blackness at MoMA. And we're delighted that Darby's here to talk about the artist Noah Purifoy. Following Darby, Esperanza Humphrey, Assistant Curator of Collections at Poster House in New York, who organized the exhibition Black Power to Black People, Branding the Black Panther Party in 2023. And our colleague Elijah Gaddis kindly suggested that she could come and speak to the interconnected history of the Black Panther Party to Lowndes County. The group conversation will be moderated by our amazing colleague Elijah Gaddis, who is the Hollifield Associate Professor of Southern History at Auburn University. And I'm so looking forward to hearing everyone in conversation. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much, Chris. It is really a pleasure to be back here in Alabama talking about Bill Traylor, who is an artist who, against the odds, made images that reached through social barriers, grabbed the attention of those who could and would preserve them, and etched his own name into American art history. Traylor was born around 1853 in rural Alabama. He made a sizable body of drawn and painted work in his final decade, and he died in 1949. When he began drawing, Traylor was living on the streets of Montgomery in declining health. This lifelong laborer took a seat, and he began to record his memories. The artist said little about his art or his life, so my presentation draws on years of research and close looking at the art, which informed the retrospective that I did for the Smithsonian in 2018. That project unraveled long-standing fictions and conveyed Traylor's personal story as the groundwater for every artwork he made. It also reconnected interrelated narratives from what was essentially a visual autobiography, which had become fractured when the images left Traylor's hands. Before the Civil War, African Americans are notably absent from government records, and the enslaved were neither authors nor stewards of their own vital documents. Records did improve after emancipation, but well into the 20th century, they still reflected pervasive errors and inconsistencies, so the facts of Traylor's life were very difficult to substantiate. We found that Traylor was born into a family enslaved by John Getson Traylor in Dallas County, Alabama. John Traylor had actually died before Bill was born, but his brother George kept the Dallas County plantation running until John's children were old enough to inherit. This included keeping the enslaved people there running the farm and as a part of John's estate property. This was Bill's childhood until he was 10. Things changed when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation was contingent on the Union winning the war, but the proclamation put Southern planters on edge. So George moved John's enslaved workers over to his own farm in Lowndes County to keep a closer eye. When Union victory formally ended slavery in 1865, Bill would have been about 12. His family was technically free to leave, but with limited means and choices, and in an environment where threats abound, the Black trailers remained on Georgia's land. For the formerly enslaved, social networks were the foundation of survival. Family boundaries were fluid and answered to need and circumstance. Considering factors of intergenerational care and a string of able-bodied labor, they were often large. And this was also because healthcare was lacking, the environment was treacherous, and survival was uncertain. Oops. We gleaned that Traylor had 3 marriages and some 15 children. Around 1908, after 55 years, Bill left trailer land. For the next 2 decades, his family worked on plantations in Montgomery County. And then as Bill's older kids began to leave the South, and especially after his 3rd wife died in the late 1920s, that became the end of Bill's farm and family life. His younger children joined older siblings in the North and in the East, and he headed alone into the capital city, where he heard there was a supportive community. Despite the larger atmosphere of oppression, the Montgomery's Black business district was a seedbed for a rising urban culture. Black schools were increasingly prevalent, programs for land ownership were emerging, and African American businesses urged Blacks to support their own. Traylor found work repairing shoes, which afforded him a rented room. Musical forms that began as the folkways of the field were urbanizing and growing popular. African Americans were growing prominence as writers, scholars, artists, and agents of social change. By the late 30s, Traylor's health had declined and he became unable to hold a job or pay rent. He began spending nights in local businesses and days perched around the neighborhood, drawing scenes inspired equally by his past and his present. Traylor became an artist at a time and in a place wherein personal expression for Black Americans posed inherent risk. Perhaps he felt invisible on the busy streets, or maybe he had nothing left to lose. In his last decade, Traylor made well over 1,000 artworks, although only pieces made between 1939 and 1942 are known to have survived. The difference between Traylor's rural past and his city surroundings was, of course, stark. He spent his final years looking back at a hard, oppressive past and glimpsing a future that he wouldn't live to fully experience. Traylor found his creative voice without guidance, and his works are neither straightforward memory paintings nor realistic depictions from life. He was a very careful editor. He chose his subjects with intention, and he omitted a great deal. Traylor's imagery narrates, but it isn't linear, and it records without being straightforward. To our knowledge, he never learned a craft, such as basket weaving or throwing pots, but he was clearly familiar with practices that were both creative and utilitarian. Traylor's imagery draws heavily on the folkways and traditions of his personal world, but his art is self-directed and unique. He began with rudimentary drawings like these in 1939 when he was about 86. Traylor takes stock of his surrounding world and he labors to describe the people, animals, and objects that he sees. Increasingly, he organizes his scenes as narratives. In this picture of the blacksmith shop, Traylor depicts a neighborhood local called Jimmy, confirming that he was drawing real people and events. The earliest works are graphite and colored pencil, and within a year, Traylor was using crayon, charcoal, and water-based paints, which were given to him by local artists who took an interest. They offered clean paperboard as well, and Traylor did use this, but he often worked on cast-off pieces of cardboard from commercial packaging or advertisements. Traylor never became literate, but with help, he developed a drawn version of his name that he sometimes added as a signature. His awareness of letters as conveyors of meaning manifests in many places, including painstaking replications of Depression-era posters for programs like the Works Progress Administration and the National Recovery Administration. Traylor often remarked that his figures were reading, noting that the objects marked with ABC were books. His letters were irregular, but his images and comments show awareness of literacy as a powerful tool and one that he had been denied. In an unconventional way, Traylor's art became a literary vehicle. He wrote his own story using a vocabulary of pictures. Having lived on farms surrounded by woods for most of his life, Traylor knew the varied physiques and characters of many creatures. He astutely contrasted horses and mules, and his brief but telling remarks revealed a grasp of metaphor, symbolism, and letting animals stand in for people. About the long-faced mule on the left, Traylor said, "He's sullen." Given the long-standing connections between mules and Black laborers, it's hard to imagine that he didn't intend to convey a social parallel. And about the skeletal horse on the right, Traylor remarked, "Turned him out to die." He shows a wide-eyed beast left to forage until death takes him, suggesting the artist's empathy for an animal that was only valuable during his prime and then cast out, aged and alone, when no longer able to earn his keep. Songs and stories have always been communication vehicles, and throughout history, allegorical folk tales have told subversive stories under the guise of animal legends. Some of Traylor's earliest images narrate pursuit, with animals only thinly disguising parallel stories from the human world. Rabbit, of course, is an iconic character, meek, but also clever and fast. Traylor often drew Rabbit on the run, and often with uncannily human-like legs. In a scene like this, the equivalence between Rabbit and a fleeing man is clearer. Pursued by a hatted man and a dog, the sole character painted in black runs for his life. A wide-eyed rabbit matches his pace, and birds overhead may signal the hope of escape. Traylor's dogs span docile pets to lethal foes. Canines are still common, of course, on farming as hunting aids, but on plantations, they were also trained to hunt and kill humans. This is a reality that extended well past the days of slavery. And Traylor's many dogfights reveal an abiding drive to convey that raw ferocity, the indescribable terror that these beasts inspired. Some of his dogs may reference the larger paradox of slavery. Here, Traylor uses scale and dynamic to describe an enraged and mighty creature bound effectively by social agency and wealth. And sometimes it's color that most effectively transmits the raw fury that the artist was summoning. These drawings rarely have one clear-cut meaning, but Traylor's ability to convey tension was masterful. He captured emotion through encounter, position, color, and a brilliant use of negative space to describe gesture and force. His characters jump, point, and tumble, and the dynamics of power and fear are clear. His characters enact wordless, open-ended stories of high drama. And open-ended is a really key idea because Traylor would have understood the need to walk a line between recording those raw memories and withholding a forthright critique of white society. Many of his images allude to interior struggles with a little figure troubling a larger one. Here especially, the man's burden appears to be a moral one. The little voices into either ear suggest a battle with oneself. Vice tempts with a flask, virtue preaches righteousness, pointing towards a heaven-bound path. Traylor was raised in a Baptist environment and converted to Catholicism in his final days. He didn't clearly articulate his religious views, but his images suggest fusions of the Black Christian church, African religions and traditions, and the folk recipes and rituals known as conjure, hoodoo, or root work, supplemental practices for lives that demanded an arsenal of options. Traylor sometimes depicted strange or disturbing encounters, reflecting perhaps the bad dreams that plagued him increasingly as he aged. His men spanned types and roles: common folk, athletic icons, businessmen, and people of wide-ranging physique and ethnicity. Men dressed to the nines have been explored as the Undertaker, personifications of death, or the Conjure Man, all powerful roles that Traylor's character may step in and out of. He identified this man as Ross the Undertaker. David Ross Sr. was the co-owner of the Ross Clayton Funeral Home and an icon of the Black business district. And moreover, for Traylor, he was the man that gave him a place to sleep at night. Men of electrifying power may be the preacher with hands reached toward the heavens, or the good time man, drinking and smoking. And drinking was a topic unto itself in Traylor's work. Liquor is often shelved, just out of reach, metaphorically hidden or hard to get. These figures reveal Traylor's capacity to let form describe feeling. Unbound by realism, their loose limbs convey sensations of inebriation, possibly Traylor's own personal snare, purportedly once confessing, "What little sense I did have, whiskey took away." Traylor sometimes portrayed himself. In one such image, a bearded figure using two canes closely resembles the artist around the time he made it. Another shows a more vigorous man, possibly Traylor recalling his once strong body. Traylor prized the color blue, especially this radiating ultramarine poster paint. African American culture often associates blue with protection, a color that might shield one from unhappy spirits. But Traylor used blue in a variety of ways. Blue might signal power and presence one time, and another time hint at protection or luck, a character defying the odds or slipping past trouble. Black life in Montgomery was a world apart from the old farm days, and Traylor relished it. These men wear suits. The women are bedecked in prints, colors, and finery, and they hold their heads high. Traylor's house scenes recall 7 decades of plantation life. Commotions tangle and swirl, and the routine and horrific events bleed together. It is probably the house scenes that most clearly show his stylistic evolution. Hesitant explorations of interior versus exterior become stage sets for complex narratives. And later, Traylor bypasses the details, making fluid improvisational paintings that really just pack an emotional punch. Traylor also staged eventful moments on abstracted structures. Researchers Miriam Fowler and Marcia Weber proposed that these reduced forms were drawn from things in Traylor's rural surroundings, from a diving platform on the Alabama River to equipment like the cotton press or the whiskey still. By arranging scenes on vertical scaffolds, Traylor could prevent synchronous events instead of a comic-like chronology. He employs chaos and precarious balance to set up tensions and impending consequence. Filmmaker Jeffrey Wolf extended the idea of recast structures into Traylor's Montgomery environment, including the Court Square Fountain and the Klein and Son clock. Clock and human hands are conflated as a figure stands marking time on an open-faced dial. And sometimes the clock and fountain converge, landmarks of time and place that are both loose and specific in the way of memories. But even when Traylor's sites diverge from realism, they never can be presumed neutral. This painting, for example, stages on a domed structure resembling the Alabama Capitol building, which is a looming presence seen easily from Court Square Fountain, which is itself a very potent site because it hosted one of the South's largest slave markets at one time. Assessing the scene in the context of this anguished corridor shifts the lens through which we see it. A preacher-like man atop the dome raises a hand towards heaven while horrifying events play out below. The person fleeing the axe-bearing man is raw, exposed, and nakedly terrified. Violence infuses Traylor's work, but his sparse stages may be the most charged. Echoes of the fountain and clock recede to a more skeletal frame, an auction block that once occupied that same space on Commerce Street, just 2 blocks from his perch on Lawrence and Monroe. The racial terrorism of lynching peaked between 1877 and 1950, spanning Traylor's adult lifetime. The brutal scenes plaguing his memory push onto paper time and again. From the time they were first collected, Traylor's tree scenes were referred to as possum hunts, but the animals were never the only creatures being hunted. In a few images, Traylor pushed the limits of what white society might tolerate from an old Black man, showing scenes of lynching more clearly. Ultimately, Traylor developed into a sophisticated artist in just a few short years. World War II disrupted his interaction with the Montgomery artists who supported him and collected his work. He left the Black business district and visited children in the North and in the East, and then he took up in an encampment overlooking the Alabama River. After 1945, he went to live with a daughter in town. Pictured here in her yard after having lost a leg, Traylor continued painting into the late 1940s. The art he made during this period appears in photographs, but none of it is known to have survived. Posthumously, Traylor became celebrated as an accidental modernist whose somber silhouettes compressed a universe of feeling into the flattest of shapes. But his aims were never those of the art world. Artistically, Traylor's work is exceptional, but its historical position and account of the drawn-out moment between slavery and the civil rights movement is singular. Without the artist to confirm or refute, we can't make authoritative claims about his meanings or intentions. When Traylor's visual messages are read collectively, however, his voice rings clearly like a bell. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to take a minute to thank Chris and Cindy and everyone that you all work with for the invitation and for the a great amount of facilitation in the course of planning. Sorry I needed so much help, but I really did. Whatever. I keep the focus on my gratitude and on the people who facilitated me, not on how helpless I am. Anyway, that's a title that I should have put a question mark after place because as you'll see, we're going west of here, but it's not at all clear that it's to a southern place that we're headed. This is an aerial view of Noah Purifoy's outdoor Desert Museum of Assemblage Art. That is the name of the institution that is located on this site. The boundaries of the institution, formally speaking, are these inside of the laser line that I'm drawing you. We're in the Mojave Desert. We're in Joshua Tree, California, about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, depending on traffic, due east of Los Angeles. And here is the form there. In the center is the form there that I'm going to focus on today. There's a sculpture in the Mojave Desert that may remind you of an old photograph you've seen 100 times. If you are so reminded while facing this sculpture, as I was, then you have a way to make sense of it. I took such a detour on the way to White Colored, it's the title of the work, which Noah Purifoy raised in 2000, 11 years into his desert period. He went to Joshua Tree to live out the rest of his life and work in 1989. When I finally faced the unsatisfying consequences of my detour, I had to ask myself why it had felt right to look away. I had to think about how often this happens in the course of cultural study or the study of art. This action that effectively changes art, lifts it out of history just to keep an idea intact. The photograph in question had cleared up a blur that I think is very important to the Purifoy sculpture that I want to think about. Before continuing, though, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the earlier chapters of Purifoy's life. He was born black in Snow Hill, Alabama, in Wilcox County, the 10th of 13 children on August 17, 1917. That was the year of the East St. Louis Massacre, the year of the silent protest from Harlem into Manhattan, and the year of the debut of Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, the famous sculpture of the urinal turned upside down at the Armory show, at the Independence show. Purifoy's family moved to Birmingham when he was 3 years old and then north to Cleveland, Ohio when he was 12. He recalled growing up in poverty, very happy and very loved. He would return to the South to attend Alabama Teachers College prior to enlisting in the Navy during the Second World War, which he passed working construction posts in Guam and on the Big Island of Hawaii. After this service, he took a master's degree in social work from Atlanta University, graduating in 1948, but made no formal use of that training. He had fallen in love with Los Angeles during a Navy layover and settled there in 1952. On a whim, he enrolled in Chouinard Art Institute, which was later absorbed into Cal Arts, which granted him a BFA in 1956. Following this, his fourth graduation, Purifoy worked as a freelance interior and industrial designer until 1964, when he went full-time at the Watts Towers Art Center, where we see him photographed here with Judson Powell, his friend and collaborator. In both pictures, Purifoy's on the left in the left-hand picture, and on the right, standing up in the striped shirt in the right-hand picture. He became director of the center in 1965, assisted by Judson Powell, a musician, and Sue Welsh, a school teacher. At the center, he mainly devised and taught art-based education programs for children, programs intended, in his words, to raise the level of their self-image. By his own early and late accounts, it was at the center that Purifoy established and met all of the goals that he had ever had as an artist in the aftermath of the August 1965 Watts Rebellion, which he watched from the center's doorstep. While the embers cooled, Purifoy and others gathered some 3 tons of debris with a vague plan of using it later as art material. And this is an image of the debris as it was photographed after the fact. The assemblages and collages created out of this accumulation were shown in 66 Signs of Neon, an exhibition of 66 artworks by an interracial group of 6 artists. It ran at Markham Junior High School in Watts during April and May of 1966. All of the works in the show were either sold, lost, or destroyed on a subsequent world tour, and the exhibition's remains returned to Los Angeles by truck in the summer of 1969. And I noticed this morning, just parenthetically, in the wonderful collage that you have in the collection here at the Jewel, there's a slide of Purifoy with one of his contributions to the exhibition in Watts, right at the center of the object. There's an old, like, Ektachrome slide, which I had seen millions of years ago, but was very pleased to see again this morning. These are two Xeroxes of photographs in Purifoy's archive that he had lots and lots of copies of these copies, and they're all over the archive and appearing in different years, different kinds of piles. They were very important to him. He never narrated their importance to him, so I'm left to speculate, but there was something he liked very much about whatever it is that he saw and felt in response to these images. Even prior to its use to fashion artworks, Purifoy saw something in the rubble. I think he saw momentous creative action, a way that rebuilding might look in those passionately chaotic days and their material aftermaths. His loving and magnanimous perception struck me very deeply. in the course of my encounters with it in the archives over the years, as did the fact that Purefoy would go on to act on this perception again and again for the rest of his life. First, through his further works at the Watts Towers Art Center, then during a stint teaching at UC Santa Cruz, and then throughout his term from 1976 to 1982 as a founding member of the California Arts Council. On either side of this service, he worked as an artist, known but not well known. In fact, for the most part, Purefoy's art history is as someone important for inspiring more renowned figures like Senga Ngugi and David Hammonds. In fact, Purefoy would retire entirely from art, quit the art world in his terms in 1972, before returning to it somewhat reluctantly in the mid-1980s. In 1989, when he could no longer make his rent in Los Angeles, he accepted a friend's offer to occupy a trailer on her land in Joshua Tree, just outside the northwest boundary of the national park there. There, he worked in assemblage and fashioned environments, as he had throughout his time as an artist. But in Joshua Tree, he mainly worked outdoors and sometimes at scale, having first a 7.5-acre plot and eventually 11 acres of desert scrub and a Quonset hut to occupy. And here I want to show you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pictures of the site, just to give you a feel for where one is when one gets out there. There's a sign. It's very easy to miss this place. You really have to know where you're going. This is a welcome form that he made from tires and studs. It's kind of a front door, but there is no front door. There's no fence. It's 11 acres. You can go in wherever you want to. It's a brilliant. This place is so funny and inspiring and inspired. This is a work that one of the first things he made there. He always wanted to make what he called a mondrian that you could walk through. It's a work called Sculpture Defined. I took these pictures. These are not professional pictures. I needed images to show my students and to show people like yourselves. So there are 117 forms on 11 acres. Yeah, wow. There are hallways, as it were. It's a museum, after all. He named it such. There are works separated. There are no labels. There are hallways. This is a shopping cart, in case you've never been to a grocery store. And these are two very early views of forms that he created in 1989, shortly upon arrival, before they faded, before the weather got at them. Okay. Thanks for that. I hope I didn't waste too much time, but I wanted to give you a sense of place. When, almost 10 years ago, I first encountered this assemblage, I felt it easy to see. Easy because it felt to remember, like something from the well-known photograph I mentioned at the beginning by the Russian-American photographer Elliot Erwitt, made in 1950. There's the photograph on the right, known via the Magnum Photography Agency as North Carolina 1950. I later realized that art historical common sense had preempted an effort to think about what I was actually looking at. Precisely because it works with the photograph so closely, the sculpture needs an effort to decouple it, not only from its referent in the photograph, if indeed the photograph is a referent for the work, but also from the too easily retold stories that the photograph is used to support. Stories about race and publicness in the United States. Out there in the Mojave, the deal that I'm in calls for work against the explaining, rational comprehending that my archive and my professional proclivities, as well as our civic stories, instigate. The Erwitt, or my memory of the Erwitt photograph, brought a kind of lively relief that I had found wanting in my real situation with the exact and complete, yet inconclusive sculpture on the left. Understanding that eventually, the task was now to remain with the Purefoy in the realm of real matter, where meanings move, where white-colored has real difficulties to put across. Really important questions that I think it's there to help us ask and formulate, or at least attempt to formulate responses to. I didn't say answers, responses to questions that are important questions to some of us. For example, I often need the water that the sculpture appears at first to have to offer me. It's the Mojave Desert. You need water. It's a very bad idea to be out there in any season without water. It's work to remember that the object of art isn't there to meet the needs that I bring to it. It's there to draw me out of myself. Already, it's quite inconsistent with the thinking that many scholars tend to enact with the help of what are sometimes called civil rights photographs. This is a whole genre of photography and American studies analysis, the civil rights photograph. Sometimes the studies are reminiscent, to me anyway, of what scholar Adolph Reed called segregation nostalgia. He coined that term in 1994 in reference to cultural products from scholarship to popular film that impose order on our racially messy world, that project image after image of a comfortably static past, a situation simpler and more settled than the present. In what he calls this dream world respite from racialized tension, inhabitants of non-identical cultural positions can remain isolated and insulated from one another, as well as from everything that makes social life social, namely friction. Reed's critique, I think, has a compelling forerunner in Urwitz's photograph, which effectively shows how, even under de jure segregation, people trampled what was called the color line, eroded structures of difference. Mixing, racial mixing, threatened to implode long discrete racial populations as people broke away from in-group ties and followed new lines of assimilation and acculturation. In this photograph, the implosion that I'm referring to emerges into an icon of structural racism in the form of a visible line of union, where separated waters mix again. From mixing emerge confounding, sometimes upsetting cultural forms about which we sometimes need to be able to say that we do not know what sort of thing we are dealing with. We don't have a name for it yet, and that can be a very anxiety-making lack. So far, no scholar of the image that I know has met this image's respect for that kind of doubt about what we can name and what we cannot in the cultural milieu that we make together. One precious hermeneutic that every single act of integration jeopardizes is the idea of the finitude of the Black-white relation, which is, of course, a main framework for doing US history. That is why in my own work, I try to keep alive the relationship between what's called the Black world and its counterpart worlds, a rapport that we usually render in a misleadingly neat set of postulates. I find it a help to welcome the clamor of new identities and identifications, to welcome blur, because in integrated conditions, however localized they may be, the possible relations between identities which exist stop having definite or definable limits, such as those that segregation devices existed to impose. Identities and relations cease to be completely determinable in theory because they are no longer being determined or predetermined in fact. I know that these are challenging ideas and that mind clenches in the face of some of them. I think the clenching itself heralds a natural propensity to cling to certain basic structures, which we place outside of history and treat as abstractions. Such pictures of the social order, most of them photographs, or many of them photographs, I should say, not most, many of them photographs, stand ready to illustrate these abstractions. The shock of their violence hushing the pandemonium of the racial real. Urwitz, who was Russian-American and white, I should make it clear in case it's of interest to any of you. It matters, I think. I don't know how, but it does. Urwitz made this exposure during a trip to North Carolina at the age of 22, still sporting a Russian accent. This is the Magnum Agency's most requested image of the civil rights era. Thanks in part to extensive research by Elizabeth Abel, we know that photographs of fountains and bathrooms are reproduced more than any other category of Jim Crow images and tend to be mentioned most frequently as icons of Jim Crow. In fact, the segregated drinking fountains documented in this very photograph are also reproduced at the entry to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, while the photograph itself is reproduced at the beginning of the last installment of Ebony Magazine's coverage of Negro History, a famous set of journalistic interventions made in August of 1960, I should say published in August of 1962, as well as appearing in many documentaries such as the justly legendary Eyes on the Prize. But Irwit's picture differs from the others in the genre, I think from every one of them, in an important but overlooked way, in that it's having a laugh at the junction where the races mix in the runoff from the separate and separating fountains. This picture doesn't merely document the system. It underlines a way that the system enabled the social process that it outwardly abhorred. With as much as 70 years exposure to such images, someone encountering Purifoy's sculpture might feel to know more or less what they're dealing with in the sculpture. A frozen narrative, somehow still topical, wherein racial segregation stops white and colored from flowing into each other, setting hard limits to opportunity and redefining racial consciousness. A person might begin to wonder if the most important cultural work that iconic images like this do is to perpetuate an idea that there is a readily intelligible social order in which we dwell. A conception, a single conception of the Black-white relation that might explain it all in one go. In other words, we inhabit a culture that tolerates images of interracial beings and phenomena, while at the same time craving after a picture of race relations that is static and fixed. I think this is a paradox that we must accept rather than resolve. To accept this paradox is to accept the difficulties that follow from losing a clarity on which everything can seem to depend. In gesturing towards this goal, I do not wish to sneer at the desire for intelligibility and clarity, not at all. And I'm nowhere near saying that things are somehow better now. That's not my view. My view, rather, is that things are very different and that the difference that today makes must factor in rigorous considerations of cultural and cultural history. Purifoy always thought that we made too much of separateness, that of people and that of art, in respect to our life, as art and life have come to be treated with regard to one another. He hated the separation of art and life, hated it. He didn't hate much, but he hated this. He thought separateness inhibited imagining and doing the informal, necessarily interhuman work of creativity, of living in a world that is actually, and in fact, continually creating itself. The construction in his Mojave art garden is 6.5 feet across, 11 feet high, and 3 feet deep. It is all dynamics. At once a physical signifier of the concretion of difference into a kind of fixed Manichaean whole, and an icon of this difference continually emptying itself out. Although Purifoy employs a low pedestal placed on the desert floor and puts a lid on the work, these framing devices do nothing to close the form. Its material plurality, not to mention its changes, which are ongoing and multiple and absolutely impossible to keep up with. I visit this thing at least 2 or 3 times a year, and the changes are bewildering. So much happens so fast. Make the work formally equivocal. It's always showing new faces, always making different statements. Its sheer exposure to wind, the contractions of cold, the expansions of heat, and by wind, I mean Santa Ana winds and El Niños. I don't mean casual breezes. Its exposure exacerbates a quality that makes artworks and assemblage especially difficult to displace into impersonal time. And I'm thinking of the impersonal time of art history writ large, or the museum writ large, or history writ large. You can't move a work like that into that space without losing what makes it what it is. Works of assemblage make many identities and relationships available, all of which are necessary to take into account. Everything matters, although unequally. Cacophony is certain, and in dealing with a work like this, one of the open possibilities is permanent uncertainty. This deferral of synthesis is an ongoing operation of all the work in the desert, of his work in the desert, which Purifoy constructed into the immediate context of life. I would also say into the immediate context of nature, but I don't think there's separating life and nature in this context or in any other context, frankly. Oh, I have this list of materials here if I had more time, I would make a point of letting you know how differently each one of these kinds of materials ages and responds to the environmental pressures that they're under. So it's all changing, but every component of it is changing out of sync with the other components. Even parts of components are changing out of sync based on how much or how little they're exposed to the light and the wind and the cold and the animals and the vandalism and everything else. There's no security at this museum. It's as exposed as you can get. Anyway, I just did what I said I wouldn't do. Apologies, Chris. Sorry, Chris, and everybody else. Some components show no apparent changes at all. For instance, the vitrified porcelain of the toilet basin will persist for a very long time, but many components never appear the same way twice. 2 visits to the site, an unguarded open-air museum, are all that it takes to understand that every material is reacting continuously by changing to its total and ongoing exposure. Baking, blackening, blooming, blowing away, burnishing, chipping, crumbling, eroding, fading, oxidating, recoloring, sagging, sinking, swelling, tearing, warping, filling up, hollowing out. So your object is always changing in ways that matter. As each particularity makes its distinctive appeal, only later to make another distinctive appeal another way, total havoc overtakes your sense of the signifying that this artwork is doing. Purefoy himself said in 2003, a year before his death, quote, "So far as being permanent, I don't think these works are permanent. I think it goes with nature," end quote. And indeed it does. At the site, the apparently mutual sympathy between art forms and natural forms is as cryptic as it is profound. For instance, 2 large weedy creosote stands accompany white-colored in space. These are the creosote stands. Like, if you know what creosote is, that's great. If you don't, we can talk about it later. It's an ancient plant. It's a water system. So it means there's a water system planted within and beneath these water fountains. I lost my place. For instance, 2 large weedy creosote stands accompany white-colored in space. These 2 bushes are the most prominent specimens on the entire 11-acre site. A creosote endures in a way that the art on the art site will not endure. And I really want to know what Purefoy knew about the creosote, but this knowledge is not available to me. I've been through the entire archive and every conversation he had with anyone I can find. No idea. Sometimes I feel robbed of narrative opportunities. I'm similarly keen to know more than I can know about why he chose the turn of the millennium to raise a non-functioning segregation device in a place with almost no society to segregate, only then to frame a view of its breakdown. In the midst of this questioning, I am reminded that true communication with an external object involves a compromising concession on the part of the self. I cannot ascertain which of the work's many tones rings truest. So I ask instead, what can I do for Purefoy with all this not knowing, this desire to know, this instability, and this development? What can be the cultural history of objects and of a figure so exceptionally hard to behold? By the evidence of what the artist said, he was no big booster for academic enterprises like the ones that I do, especially not the parts involved with preservation, interpretation, and explanation. And I mean to honor that doubt in portraying his thought with due respect for the skepticism and comfort with the necessity of loss that made it go. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Before I begin, I would love to just thank you all for being here, for coming out. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes. I too was a little bit difficult too, getting myself together, but Everyone, the whole team, Chris, everyone was just so gracious. I also want to thank Elijah for coming to Black Power to Black People back in 2023. It was my first show ever as a curator. I don't even think I had the curator title at that time. And it was just something that I was just trying to prove who I was. And I think this is a testament to that work. And then lastly, I want to thank my mom for showing me the 4 Little Girls documentary when I was 6 years old, and introducing me to Alabama civil rights specifically. So a lot of thank yous. But yes, I'm Esperanza. I'm the assistant curator of collections at Poster House. Poster House is located in New York City. If you're looking to go to New York City, don't go now because it's negative something degrees in New York City. So what is a poster? I put this slide here not because I don't trust that you all don't know what a poster is, but it's part of the work that we have to do at Poster House. A lot of the time we have students come in and they're like, what makes posters so important? I walked by a lot today, and that's the point, right? You walk by so many posters throughout the day. You probably all walked by at least 5 as you entered into the building. So they're everywhere. And though I have all of these little points, they're very tiny on the slide, I want to focus on 2. The first one I want to focus on is bullet number 3, the intersection of art and commerce. Well, actually, I want to focus on the last 3. The intersection of art and commerce, thinking about that relationship of like the work of a poster, that artistic nature of a poster. Posters aren't created by artists, they're usually created by graphic designers or illustrators. And so you think about that combination because they're not really trying to sell the poster, they're trying to sell the product, right? So that's the commerce. And then the combination of visual and text, you're gonna see a lot of visual and text throughout my slides, but that's what a poster is doing, right? They're using visual and text, and we call that the visual language. And I think we all speak a visual language. At Poster House, we do blind and low vision tours, but part of the educator's responsibility is to describe that poster because everyone should be able to experience this medium. And then lastly, it's the most democratic medium. We say that because you actually don't have to pay anything to see a poster. You can walk through, especially in New York, you can walk through the streets and interact with posters, see those posters, and you don't have to pay anything. You do have to pay to come into Poster House though, but it's free on Fridays, but it is the most democratic medium because like if I wanted to see the Mona Lisa, I know I have to pay a certain rate and then I have to go see the Mona Lisa. And there's usually only one, right? When we think about fine art. So all of that to say that posters function in a very unique way in our society. And so I want to take a minute to look at this poster over here, and you all are going to have to play the role of my students for a minute, because I want you all to just take in some of the messaging and the visual, that visual plus text in this poster. You're probably noticing some words. You're probably noticing a very powerful graphic in the center. And the combination between those 2 things is probably helping you build a picture around why this thing is so important. You might feel that bold graphic is aggressive. You might feel just that it's powerful. You might feel that there's a message and you're like, I don't really know what's going on with this, but I can't wait for Esperanza to continue to talk and tell me more about this thing. But whatever you're feeling from this poster, whatever you're feeling from these graphics, it's making you feel something, right? And that's why posters play a large role in the way we communicate as a society. So some history, we did that little inquiry of that poster, but let's go back because the first thing that I had to do to research for a show about the Black Panther Party was, 1, practice deference because I was born in the 90s, and I had to reach out and interview people and understand a history and understand oral histories. And it was not as easy as just saying the Black Panther Party was named after a panther. And that took me back to Black voting in Alabama. So there was large-scale disenfranchisement in Alabama, as you all know. The Democratic Party was heavily ruled by a man named George Wallace. I'm in Alabama right now. I don't think I need to explain who this person is, but let's just say someone out there might not be familiar. I encourage you to just look up that name right now and look at the famous quote, and it starts with segregation and it ends with forever. So do with that information what you will, but George Wallace is very important in this story. I'll speak more about not specifically him, but the type of politics around his name. And then we have the Democratic Party being the party of white supremacy for the right. That's in quotes for a reason, and I'll explain a little bit more later. But their icon was that white rooster. So during the march from Selma to Montgomery, the SNCC party under the leadership of Stokely Carmichael, who was part of SNCC, so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, under his leadership, they stopped in Lowndes County, and Stokely Carmichael's pretty surprised because Lowndes County is about 80% non-white, and he can't believe that there is not a large voting turnout in the county. And he starts to galvanize some of the SNCC members and some of the local community and he goes door to door too. And he's thinking, how can we get some type of voter turnout or some type of voter education in this specific concentrated area of America? So the Lowndes County Freedom Organization is founded in 1965. And I should mention that George Hewlett is a large part of this story as well. Again, I'll come back to his name, but he also decides to have a part in the Lowndes County Freedom Organization for galvanizing voters. And I believe at this time, George Hewlett was like one of 2 people registered actually to vote. But remember, back to the top of this slide, there's large scale disenfranchisement. And there's Stokely Carmichael. So that poster making process, we have to think about, okay, we have this Lowndes County Freedom Organization, and there's a saying, there are a few documentaries, by the way, about this, but there's a saying of, we need a mean black cat to run that old rooster out of this town. That's a direct quote, by the way, to vote the old rooster. There's a large illiteracy rate. And so Alabama state law says you have to have a voting emblem so that people know that the party that they're voting for. And so that's where that quote is coming from. We have to figure out something, but spoiler, like, of course it's gonna lead to the Black Panther, but we don't know that yet, right? So the SNCC coordinators that are in Lowndes County contact Ruth Howard, who's in Atlanta. And they say, we need some type of emblem. There's a large illiteracy rate. We need some type of emblem. Some stories say that Ruth Howard's first version of the emblem is a white dove. I don't think that was as powerful. And so she looks to the Clark College mascot, now Clark Atlanta, the Clark College mascot, and that is a Black Panther. And so she sends that over, and Jennifer Lawson, who was in charge of creating the poster, she would draw posters, hand draw posters, pamphlets, voting signs, all of those things for the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. When she gets the Panther, she just starts reproducing it on all of their printed works. And that's why you see this image here where it says the voting day, and then you have that Black Panther tucked behind the tall grass. And this gentleman, I believe, from an interview from Jennifer Lawson, I believe he was from Philadelphia. So he took up arms to come to Lowndes County and stand in front of that sign. So that Black Panther is there, and that's why a lot of people say this is the original Black Panther Party, because what ends up happening is as word spreads, a lot of people are saying, you hear about those crazy people in Bloody Lowndes trying to get people to vote. Yeah, that's that Black Panther Party. So part of that like colloquial language of referring to the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, that Black Panther Party. So that's why they're the original Black Panther Party. So that's what happens as word spreads. And SNCC coordinators are using educational materials and workshops to educate people on Black people on voting. This only scrapes the surface because there is still mass aggression in Lowndes County. And if I had maybe one more hour, if anyone would give me one more hour to speak, I will go into all of the detail, but I don't have enough time, so let's keep going. And then there's this quote at the bottom, it says, pull the lever. At the side of the poster, you'll see pull the lever for the Black Panther Party. Behind it says, and go home. That type of language is interesting because today, like pull the lever, I've never pulled the lever to vote. So that is a specific language of its time. Again, think about that power of the poster. It's also giving us a sense of the time period that we're speaking about. Pulling the lever and going home means there are probably going to be white supremacists outside of that area. Pull that lever and go straight home. And that's why this image is so powerful of an armed man in front of the sign. It's just adding to the layers of some of the experiences. So these are some materials that they're actually all available for public access. So if anyone is interested, I pulled a lot of these from NAMOC, so the National Museum of African American Culture and History, and then also a university archive. And so that the top of the left, it's like a pamphlet, kind of like a booklet. It says white supremacy for the right. So that's where that quote comes from. And then the Democratic Party of Alabama. At the time, Democratic Party is the party of white supremacy. Today, whatever. But that's what they associated it with. And then you have the next logo, which is that Black Panther. So they're using that visual language because they know if people can't read, they can definitely identify that this panther is associated with Black voting rights. And then they have these illustrative manuals, and they chronicled their own history, by the way. So when you go online and you find the digitized version of this, you'll see it acts as a history book of sorts. And these are graphics. Jennifer Lawson was a really big part of this, but these are graphics basically explaining why voting is so important, who is going to show up and enact aggression at the polls. What do you do after you pull that lever? You go home. What does a ballot look like? It was all an educational narrative, and in the form of these illustrations, these hand-drawn illustrations, these man-made pamphlets with these illustrations. And I screenshotted one page, but I encourage you to look through them. They even have their own depiction of like the Ku Klux Klan, like identify these people and this is what you're voting against. So in addition to the posters, all of their printed work is just very impressive. And to find out where they were doing all of this work, it's even more impressive. So I put this slide because I was bewildered. I was so in shock by the fact that as I went through these pages, I saw that this image on the left, it said poll tax, so date paid poll tax right there. And I knew that there was a poll tax, but some sources said it was $3. So then I decided, let me just go to the New York Times archives to find the exact number. So it's $1.50. The Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. The Lowndes County Freedom Organization is founded in 1965. This newspaper article on the right is from March 4th, 1966. So that's a year after the Voting Rights Act is passed. The Voting Rights Act would have been passed, I think, in November. This is a year after that. Adjusted for inflation, that poll tax is about $15 today. That is egregious. In addition to all of the other things, that is really just an extra layer onto that disenfranchisement conversation, on top of the aggression, on top of this poll tax, on top of everything else. The word bloody Lowndes really has a different meaning once we really factor in and bake in everything else, everything that was going on. So this is the New York Times article that specified the poll tax and the day that they said that you can no longer do a poll tax. So what happens by the 1970s? Well, no members of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization were elected in 1966. There were a number of people up against the formal Democratic Party. None of them were elected. I ended up reading a really great article that was written maybe a day after elections, maybe a couple of days after. And their spirits, the article was saying, but this is really important because it's the first time that Black people in the county turned out to have a voice and a vote and understood that power of numbers. We will continue to advocate for the right to vote, because if this showed us anything, even if we didn't win, it showed us that there is so much power in the Black vote. And the fact that people were shaking, the white population was shaking, because I think about like 6% of the Lowndes County, the white 6% of Lowndes County owned most of the like property, but they had a lot of sharecroppers on their properties. So they realized it is our voice that's going to change this. The Lowndes County Freedom Organization also received party status, so they became the Lowndes County Freedom Party, but unfortunately was very short-lived because it merged with the Democratic Party, that party that I was talking about earlier. But Hewlett, who I mentioned earlier, is elected sheriff, and he serves as sheriff for 22 years, and his leadership in the community does not stop after that. And he's in one of the wonderful documentaries accounting this. So I want to bring us back to this poster. This now feels different for people, for all of us who saw it in the beginning. This message of move on over, or we'll move on over you, is really important, because that Black Panther, Hewlett and many other organizers said, a Black Panther will only attack you when it's been backed into a corner. You keep on backing it into a corner, you keep poking at it, it's going to attack you. And that is exactly what that power of the vote will do. It's going to, you backed us into a corner enough, we will attack. And that gives birth to what we know as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And pictured on the left, you see Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, the founders of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Eventually, self-defense is dropped from it, but it's originally founded as for self-defense. I had the pleasure of meeting Huey Newton's last wife, and she explained to me that Bobby Seale had received a Lowndes County Freedom Organization pamphlet in the mail. And when he saw that Black Panther, he knew that it was powerful, and it could be the namesake of the party that he and Huey were soon to create. So it's this and then the story continues from there, but there's not enough time. But you see the iconography on the bottom left of the poster on the left, but now it has the insignia, the Black Panther Party messaging at the bottom. And then we have almost the same poster on the right. In scale, it's larger. This was in the exhibition. And if you go through this exhibition over here, you'll see that the Move On Over one is a bit smaller, but now it's a little bit larger. And I also had the pleasure of speaking to Emory Douglas, who was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party. He has an amazing memory, by the way. He remembers specific details of everything. And a large part of his branding of the Black Panther Party was the same thing about that illiteracy. He was thinking, if you can't read these posters, if you can't read the flyers, you are going to feel the power of the visual language of a poster and of these pamphlets. So that's when we get stuff like an attack against one is an attack against all, a lot more explicit, and it's directly speaking to the slaughter of Black people. So naming things for exactly what they are. Thank you so much.
Part of asking questions of all of you that are going to bring all these wonderful presentations together. So no pressure. I'm going to talk or not talk for a few minutes, ask them some questions, and then I hope to turn things over to you. And at some point, someone's going to frantically wave and tell me to stop, and we'll take a break. So I have so many questions, and I confess that I just kind of got rid of everyone I had going into these, and so we're going to start afresh, hopefully. But I do want to start. Okay, so we have 3 folks sitting here. 4, if you include myself, who are not from, I don't think all are from Alabama, but we are talking about this sort of amazing body of art, of representation, of epistemology, ontology, anything, right, that we might sort of say that is coming from Alabama, that's coming from the South, that is coming actually even more specifically, right, from the Black Belt. And I spent 9 years in Alabama now. I'm a Southerner, but not an Alabamian. And I've been trying to understand the entire time I'm here, what is it about Alabama, or what is it about the Black Belt that sort of allows for this incredible, it's not just creativity, right, but this incredible creation and this incredible sort of outsized influence that this place that we're all in has on the world outside of it. So can y'all help me answer this question? Why Alabama is the question. You all have it.
Well, I can say that because I was doing this work on the Black Panther Party, again, I had to think about deference and think about the people who could speak to me about the history that I knew I wanted to learn and to curate for a greater audience. Post Rouse being in New York City is very much like, oh, we are so divorced from a history of enslavement. We wouldn't do that, but it's not true because I also worked in New York Historical, and one of the units that we teach is slavery in New York. And so to know that we also have to grapple with a specific type of history that is interconnected with the South, I think is really important, and to introduce this history, the iconography of Lowndes County that goes to the Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland. So if you're thinking like, coasts and everything like that, you have to tap into this dark, but also informative and in some ways celebratory history, because it really sheds light on everywhere else and where people are taking inspiration from. So I think that's why specifically the South, but more specifically Alabama is important.
Well, when I started working on the Bill Trailer show, I actually didn't work at the Smithsonian yet. And so then when I went to the Smithsonian, I had the opportunity to take that show with me and think about how it needed to be a completely different show at this different, bigger national museum. And so I started, I had responded to the art first and foremost, but then at the Smithsonian, I thought, this is the only surviving body of drawn and painted work made by a person born into slavery. And all the information I'm reading is unverified, it's hearsay, it's nobody knows what stories go together. And so it presented itself. And, when I say that Bill Trailer really gets the credit for sort of reaching through time and making that happen, he did that, and he did that by having an experience that was so potent that he took the time and effort to put those messages down.
I'm going to start my answer by just admitting that I have no idea why Alabama. But in the course of thinking about it and listening to the others, I have a feeling that maybe it might have something to do with the fact that Alabama, like a lot of other places, is not the kind of place where culture and engagements with culture and culture's intersections with politics and history writ large, and the movement of history and politics. It's not a place where it seems to me where there are great divisions between who talks about the art, who talks about the religion, who talks about the country, who talks about the craft, who talks about the advanced, who talks about the unskilled or unschooled, or the advantage of being as far as we are today from places like Washington and New York and Chicago and LA is that we don't have any felt obligation to observe and cite those institutional authorities that divide us into groups of people who can address this part, and the people who can address this part, people can and I just, driving around for the less than 24 hours, I'm struck by the amount of interpenetration I feel. Between church culture, food culture, school culture, sorority culture, retail culture, thrift shop culture. Everything's touching. Everything's always touching, but you can't always feel the contacts. You can't feel the contact points in places where things are rigidified according to institutional imperative. And I don't feel that rigidity here. I'm in jeans by accident, but I'm comfortable in jeans here. If I had shown up at the Smithsonian in jeans by accident, I wouldn't feel comfortable. And it wouldn't have anything to do with Leslie. It would have to do with the fact that you don't do that at the Smithsonian. Like, you just don't do. I hope this makes some sense, but I don't think I can't speak to the Alabama part, but I can speak to the remoteness that we enjoy today from places where categorization reigns. And even those of us who pride ourselves on being interventionists or enjoying the feeling of overturning categories and whatever, we still fall into those. Yeah. We observe, because we have respect. Hopefully we do respect for things that we're still trying to undermine or criticize. And I don't know, when I was coming in after the break, after the lunch, I said to someone, I had been here in the morning for the sewing with the group from Snow Hill, and I had a long talk with Charlie at the beginning of the morning, and then I had a chat with the deacon, with the reverend, and with several of the sewers, and I looked at the show, and I went away and I had lunch, and I came back and I said to myself out loud as I approached the building, I said, it's so important to connect art and life, as against the tendency that I think a lot of us have, no matter how schooled and whatever we are, to separate them, just for the sake of making the conversation more, I don't know, more legible or something.
Yeah, no,
That's why Alabama. It's not Alabama.
I love all the, no, it's not Alabama, but I think it is the joke. It's like sort of a cliche now that I sort of say all the time to all my students, especially, is that that Alabama and the Black Belt is the center of the world, and it's the center of the world because exactly what you're talking about, because it is at once so remote but also connected to everything, right? So I want to ask you all about history, okay? Because I was profoundly struck during all three of your talks about how you're engaging with, and these artists, I'm going to call the designers artists, are engaging with history. And I think so often, this can be a complicated question, but I think so often when we think about history, we want to put it down to a series of events, right? And we want to make it legible. We want to say, all right, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And it obviously doesn't work that way, right? It obviously is maybe instead this series of people and things and places that just keep happening and unfolding and overlapping. And I'm getting into the philosophical, but to take a more concrete example, right? Historians for the past 25 years, right, have said, we can't talk about the civil rights movement just as that thing that happens in the 1950s and 60s. We have to say there's all this work that comes before it. And especially now, we have to recognize, right, that there's all this work that keeps coming after it, right? And so I just want to ask y'all, so this is how I do questions, right? A ton of preamble to then ask what I hope is a simple question. How are these artists that you're talking about today engaging with history, the history that they're living, and maybe the history that they have lived, and maybe the history, the future that they're envisioning? We can reverse the order. We can go in the middle.
I can start again.
Okay.
I think that for the Black Panther Party is looking at recent history at that point, because that Black Panther is recent history for them at that moment. And I think to engage with that history is kind of what I mentioned about Emory Douglas later on. He's looking at that history of Lowndes County to say, okay, illiteracy is an important issue. It's something that I'm not going to demonize people for not knowing how to read it. I'm going to work within that context. I'm going to work with, again, visual language. I should get $1 every time I say that. Visual, I'm going to work within that visual language. I'm going to produce materials with other people too, by the way. Emory Douglas was the Minister of Culture, but there were a lot of people who were doing this type of work within the party. And he's engaging, he's in conversation with recent history in that moment. And then today we can, and it's okay for you to say artists, but when we think about graphic designers, now graphic designers are engaging with that proper, if we're gonna call it proper history of how do I communicate to people, whether they can read or not, whether they can, like I said, we do blind and low vision tours, whether they can see or whether they are low vision or blind. How can I make sure that I have the same, whether you're 5 or 55 and better, you get the same message from this piece. And I think that's kind of the best way I can wrap my head around that type of history.
I'm not exactly sure if I'm even remembering the question right, but I think that trailer, I mean, like none of us are maybe that aware of being living history until there comes a moment, right? And suddenly you're very aware of how things are. And, you know, Trailer lives this long life, you know, rural farming, knowing this one kind of existence. And he probably thinks it's unremarkable or not worth a story worth telling. And then things get so bad that his children all leave, and he's alone, and he goes and has this remarkable different experience. And he does consider also leaving the South, and he goes to visit children in Detroit and a few other places, and he can't, he realizes that he is as much the South as it is him, and he has to go back, even if it's not a place that he understands wanting to go back to. It's just what he knows and where he's comfortable. And so instead of like living with a daughter in Detroit, he goes and lives in a basically a homeless encampment, you know, by the Alabama River. And, you know, by that point, he's already been making these drawings. He makes them as soon as he gets to Montgomery, because he's seeing this world and he's seeing this change unfurling before him. And he knows that he's only going to get a look. He's not going to get to live it. And, you know, it's really kind of heartbreaking. But he realizes that his story, you know, I mean, I don't know what he realizes, right? I'm postulating, but I feel like he realizes that his story is worth telling because he starts to tell it, you know?
Yeah.
And that is the history of folk
Right.
culture. That's
Right,
the
right.
folklore
Yeah,
culture.
yeah. It's like memory and prophecy in some ways.
History and Purifoy, at least at Joshua Tree, I think that I think that history, that Purifoy is thinking, that's a bit much, but I postulate that he was conscious of history as one of the elements among which we live. I think that is reflected very clearly in his willingness to relinquish the structures to everything that history has to throw at them. You can talk about weather, talk about climate, but it's a great deal more than weather and climate that come after those things. Sand itself is history. All the plantings that were there and the ones that he made are history. Those plants were brought during the Pleistocene 13,000 years ago in the cheeks of plovers. That's how they got to the Mojave from Patagonia. That's history. It's a museum of history as much as anything else, you know. And on your second visit, it's already become historical because you're going to notice something that's very different to the way it was when you first encountered it. So like history will be a material part of your physical memory and probably your psychological memory of the experience. That's what I can say. I think his engagement with history is very concrete, almost literal. Almost literal. If not having been intentional per se. It's just all over the place.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
I just, you know, when Trailer would have grown up having whatever family history that was known given to him, you know, either through stories or songs, or like it would have been oral. And that would have been, you know, to some degree, that is probably how he lived with his family. But then he gets to this moment where, you know, and his parents might have said, oh, it's, you know, these things are not going to be like this. Nobody's going to remember if you don't pass down these stories, if you don't tell this, right? It will disappear. And he looks around one day and there's nobody to tell it to, you know? And so that may be why he starts to come up with this different language for telling.
Can I add something too?
Yes, please.
Just a really funny thing that happened. I don't know if funny is the word, but something that happened when I was out there studying the site. It doesn't matter how many visits in I was, but I realized that it was really important for me anyway to listen to what people say when they encounter certain things. It's a great way to learn what they are, you know, like what people say to themselves and to each other. And so I was sort of lurking nearby the fountain thing, and as best as I could tell, there was a mother and her teenage daughter looking at, there were a mother and her teenage daughter looking at the form together. And as they walked away, I heard the daughter, or the person I took to be the daughter, say to the mother, "It's sad, but it's history."
Yeah. Okay.
I just want to put that out there.
That could be the sort of motto of history, maybe.
Because it has such an open meaning in that usage.
That's right.
You know.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. Do we have time for questions? Yeah, we can do questions. Okay, yeah, I have so many more questions, but I want other people to actually get to ask them. So I think we got a few minutes, and Chris will come around with a microphone if we have. Yeah.
I have a microphone and we do have a few minutes. So put up a hand and I will come around.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlie Lucas. I want to tell you the story about Bill Traylor through my great grandmother's eyes. She used to go to Montgomery and had to work with white people in their houses. And Bill Traylor was on the street. She said, "Oh, he just an old man that draw all the time and spit on the street with snuff and stuff." And I'm like, what kind of man would do that? Because in our family, we had something what you call snuff skeeters. These was men that dipped snuff, and on the porch where the cracks would come between the board, you had to spit between that crack to make it fall down on the ground. If you didn't do it, you had to get up and clean it up. Those were the snuff skeeters. It was more like a contest. And Bill Traylor was one of the snuff skeeters. And my grandmother was a snuff skeeter too, because she dipped the snuff. So these people was in my grandmother's life when she was, before I was even here, probably before my daddy was here, whoever my daddy is. But she told me about this, and as I growed up, she always told my brothers and sisters to wreck the yard, and I would get in the yard and just draw things, all kinds of stuff. Same way Bill Traylor would do it. You can search it through my work right now. And I would be so upset with her because she just told my brothers and them to do it. Now she telling me to go do it over. And I thought I was upsetting my grandmama by drawing things all in the yard, but that's what she wanted. And she said, that's what I wanted. And she peeling peaches. I'm like, I didn't even piss my grandmama off. So all of that told me who she was and who she's seen in her life. The same way with Mo. Mo said, how many people you know can paint a watermelon under 5 or 6 minutes and sell it for $100 and you can't even eat it? Jimmy Lee Sutherland told me the same thing. Not exactly the way Mose did it. He said, how many people you know can paint a red pig out of mud and collard greens and flowers and sell it for $500 or $600? How many people you know can do that? So these were brilliant minded people that had no way to read their way out of it. Because I never went to school. I've been on my own ever since I was 13 years old. And when I started my life, everybody thought I was a fool because I left home when I was 13 years old. I wanted to go to school and to college, but I couldn't do it because it was too hard to do that back then. I got beat up so bad in '58 that I stayed in my mom and them house for 3 months in the closet because my face was swollen up. They had to feed me with a tube. That's how mean things was back then. But my grandmother was a white woman. And when I first seen her in my grandmother's house, I said, why is this person in there? She said, that's my mom. Her family took her and put her on the worst piece of property that they had and told her to make it. If you want that black man, you go live with him on the backside of the property. So she learned from that. She learned how to be a lady. This lady could cuss sideways, and she had 2 fights in the church, and they took 4 deacons to bring her out. She's a little short lady. So all her life, she had to fight to be something because she raised her kids by herself. And with Bill Traylor, she's standing up there drinking the RC drink because you couldn't buy no Coca-Cola, and they didn't allow you to buy Coca-Cola because they had cocaine in Coca-Cola. That's why you couldn't buy them there. You didn't know that. They did put it in there. But all of that told me how to go about my business. And I've been studying under my my great-grandfather and all of my family, all of my life. I've been on my own studying about them ever since I was 13 years old. And I know the skill that all those black peoples had. We had messages, just like the mailman signed a letter, we signed it with quilts. When you hung a quilt up on the line, it said something else besides looking at the beauty of it. It had a message in there. Don't you let them kids go out and work in the field because his raiders is out. All that was written in the quilts. That's why I admire these I can't say they're older women because they read along with me. I said these old sassy women that I've been with for the last few days have gave me a new life to tell me that I have did something right for our society. When you look through the museum, when I walked in this museum, I seen one of my student work hanging up on the wall. That told me I had did something right. That told me that we had a life beyond watching the white man take over our lives and tell us what to do. That told me that right there. When I seen my mom quilt with my design laying on top of it, that told me that it was uplifting my family. That's why I got off into the art field. I wanted my great-grandfather's name lifted up off the tombstone and put in books. I have accomplished that, and I never understand why he was so gentle to me. Now I know. I suffered through my schooling every day of my life because I'm dyslexic, but I can build anything. So what y'all saying is it's true, but until you live it, you won't know what the hurt feel like. You won't know what the man tell you to get out the way because your skin ain't the right color. You won't know what it feel like to walk up and want to look at a blueprint and they won't let you look at it. I've experienced all of that. At 15 years old, I couldn't learn how to build a house with a blueprint, but I learned how to build it by looking at it. So all of what we doing today is a time capsule. We putting all this back in time in a way that is showing respect, not only for the blacks, it's showing it for the whites too, because they got to keep up with our tails too. So all of this is what we supposed to have anyway. So I take my hat off, I ain't got one on, but I take my heart off to you and let you know that this is what we got to do. This is what we got to understand. This is what we got to teach our children. I helped run an art camp in Selma, and all the kids walk up to me and say, Mr. Charlie, we thank you. And that's what I thank y'all for. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for maybe one or two more. I saw a hand in the back first.
Hard to follow that up, but y'all can try.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this rich research and your generous presentations. I had a question for Ms. Humphrey, and I was wondering I was curious what you might know about the sorry? Yeah. I was curious what you might know about the LCFO's reaction to their imagery and their visual language being adopted by the Black Panthers, whether they were proud, whether they felt it had been co-opted, and second part of the question, how our culture around intellectual property and creativity today affects our ability to use each other's visual language in that way politically.
Okay, I'll try to remember the second part of the question, but I might have to get a refresher after I answer the first part. So it's hard to say how everyone felt about the Black Panther being essentially co-opted. But what I will say is from what I learned about speaking to, this is just a really important note just for everybody to know moving forward. They're not formerly in part of the Black Panther Party, they are still Black Panthers. They might call themselves Black Panther veterans, but they're still Black Panthers. So I spoke to a lot of Black Panthers, and they felt that there was, because they had to, again, it's like kind of like thinking about that recent history, because it was said, we want to start this party and we would like to borrow this iconography of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization for this party. It is said that it was, I don't want to say okay, I want to say something like, I think because the greater message was that there was this new party and the Lowndes County Freedom Organization within 5 years had already been part of the Democratic Party in Alabama, it was accepted that they were going to use that iconography. Again, I can't speak for individual stories of it, but the general consensus seems to be that once it became the Black Panther Party for self-defense, that was now the new Black Panther Party. Also, the Black Panther Party, while I was doing the 2023 show, because news was going at such an alarming rate, I found out that in New York, specifically the Black Panthers in New York, news was happening so quickly that they had to have their own publication, their own newspaper, because the Black Panther newspaper that was originally produced in Oakland it was taking too long for them to generate that much news. So for a small portion of time, New York had its own like publication, and they didn't even use the same word. They didn't use the Black Panther. It was called like the Get Down or something, like Get On, or something like that. But if you look at I think I'm forgetting the university archive that it's in, but you can read through some of these things because New York itself had its own history. So in some ways, the Black Panther Party evolves even when it has the self-defense, even when that lives on. And I think the second part of your probably was about question was about artistic liberty or artistic rights. I don't remember what exactly it was though. It was about artistic rights. But what was it though?
Well, like, what does that borrowing suggest about our current sort of culture of?
Well, that's why we say this whole thing about graphic designers never sign. 9 out of 10 times, graphic designers do not sign posters because posters were meant to be thrown away, or they, sometimes people would collect them and then they'll store them in their basement. One really interesting thing is that, and that's, them being a democratic medium is so interesting because the posters that we have to this day, I promise you after this talk, you're going to look at them so differently because they really weren't meant to be collected at any point. I'm giving you all a little tidbit, but don't tell my boss. A lot of the posters we get are from eBay because people are just like, okay, I have this thing. I'm selling it for $5. There are so many times where we've bought a poster and I'm like, this is undervalued because we're going to be showing this in a gallery. And this is from someone's collection that they just stored in their basement where they were like, I just like think about your own lives. Like you probably had band posters on your walls of your bedrooms at one point. So in terms of artistic liberties and ownership, a lot of graphic designers don't sign posters because they were never meant to be collected anyway. And so what I hope Poster House is doing is showing that graphic design is still very important, posters are still very important. And if you have preserved those things, it's kind of like what this gentleman said over here, these are part of history because they combine, again, that visual and that text, and that gives us a greater glimpse into that historical story, that story of the past. I hope I answered your question.
Fantastic. You want one last question? All right, we'll have one last question and then we'll have a break.
Thank you. This has been an amazing experience to hear everyone today. My question is for any one of the four of you. I'd love to know, are there any young artists in America right now that have really made inroads with their art, regardless of the medium, to bringing the attention, especially the young people who, in my experience with my substitute teaching that I do here in the Auburn area at the high school level, there seems to be a lot of kids that are just absolutely in love with TikTok and just kind of not really necessarily paying attention to major social issues that are happening. So I was just wondering, is there anybody out there, any young person that you all know of that is making some major inroads in this area? Thank you.
I'll start just by saying I can't name people specifically just off the top of my head because I'm terrible at that kind of thing. But I do think it's worth thinking about, especially I really appreciate Esperanza's talk about, right, when we talk with elders who are in the movement, right? I think it's really important that we listen to what they say. And one of the things that I've heard over and over from folks, right, is that the medium may have changed, right, but folks are always going to find a way to sort of get that message out. And like TikTok is not legible to me as a form of social consciousness or anything like that. But I think maybe it is. And the other thing I would just say, right, as an historian, is that people have always communicated these things to each other materially and orally in one way or the other, whether or not they produce art or artifacts or anything like that we might be able to sort of discern from that. So that's a non-answer, but it's the best one I can think of offhand. These folks might have better answers.
I guess I would just say so many, too many to answer. And that you have to just go and look at it all, because it's not until you see it over time that you start to decipher what those lasting messages are, what they're meant to be, what they're going to be to you. I mean, it can take a really long time. And so you just have to keep looking. I will say that yesterday I was at the sculpture park at the was that yesterday? Feels like yesterday, at the sculpture park for the Equal Justice Initiative. And that was such a little concentration of some of the real powerhouse artists just killing it, so it just like gives you extreme inspiration, but you just go look at everything.
I would refer your students to Khalil Robert Irving, who works out of St. Louis, but is shown internationally, shows internationally. And he's a young one who's, I think, making a really meaningful effort he's trying to have insight. It's not a self thing. Problem I have with a lot of young artists using social content is that it's ultimately look at what a great observer I am. Look how quickly I can assimilate observation into style, personal state, ego stuff. I think Khalil is really interested in looking around, and he has a style, but it's not about promoting a style. And I think Kara Walker is one for the ages. She's no longer a young person, but she brings a youthfulness and a curiosity to everything that are to me unmatched in American art and in a lot of non-American art. I can write them down after if you want.
I also want to say that the reason why I shouted out my mom, I wish this was being live streamed. She would have loved this. But is it being live streamed? No, it's not. Okay. I wish she would have loved that I shouted her out. But the reason why is because the Ford Little Girls documentary was not it was directed by Spike Lee, but it was me as a young child watching something, and I remember watching it thinking, I was 6 when she showed it to me, and then by 8 I was reading the Malcolm X autobiography, by the way. But I remember thinking Mom, did this happen yesterday? I couldn't. I was watching it, and I couldn't understand the concept of time in that way. But what was important was that I was watching that thing, whatever it was, whatever the message was, I was watching that thing as a young person. So I also think there's some power in of course, it's important to highlight young artists and young intellectuals and young curators and young scholars and all of that. But also meeting young people where they're at, where it's okay, if you're going to engage in TikTok and stuff, maybe I can take you out of that digital space and bring you into a gallery that showcases history. So it's not on paper young, but it is a part of that history, because the only way I was going to step into the door of what history could show me as a young person was for my mother to say, sit down during the summer, by the way, when I could have been playing with my friends, but during the summer, sit down, you're going to watch this documentary, and then you're going to write a report on what you learned from that. I'm not saying go do that with students, by the way. I don't think you're allowed to, but I'm just using that as an example of taking a young person and bringing them into that space of history.
Thank you all so much. Take a shorter break, and we'll meet you all back in